And if we take a look at the render, we can see a much more realistic looking tree than we would normally get with our regular species. Some of these layers will need to be changed slightly, the ecosystem layers, where we have some of the leaves a little too large compared to our other leaves. And we can see some very large ones down here, and in this section a little bit in the middle. So what you can do is pinpoint exactly which layer that is just by turning off the individual ones, and then you just change the scale in order to match that up. But we can see overall this looks really good, and it's much more realistic than we would normally get from a standard tree. I am going to open up the material for our bark. We're going to go to the top layer, and I'm going to bring our scale down to 0.8 and repopulate, make those a little bit smaller, and then also our lower, I'm going to go ahead and bring that down to 0.8 as well. And that should help some of our size. If we go to our middle layer for the density, I'm going to increase the overall density to 1000 and populate. And you can actually increase these values very, very high. The overall density amount, if you really want it to be concentrated, I've used values up to 500,000 and sometimes even more without crashing view and not oversampling too much. I'm going to make sure that I turn off decay near foreign objects for these other ones, the mid layer and lower one as well, because what it's actually using is the original leaf polygons. Since they are a separate material, those are showing up as foreign objects within the scene and might restrict some of our different ecosystem layers from being created on the ends of some of our branches. So that should be a little better now. We can zoom in, see a nice preview of a section of the tree, but I am going to zoom out and just increase that range because it looks like it's not quite enough. So go ahead and do 4 meters on each ecosystem layer, and we can zoom back in and now see a lot more of the branches. If we deselect our tree, we can move the camera around a little more independently, take a look at leaf sizes, different areas of the tree, and see some nice concentration of leaves. Now, one problem you might see is that we have a lot of leaves in the center of our branches, and that may not be very realistic. Now, one way we could fix that is by adding in an object that would work as a foreign object. So we would need to turn back on decay near foreign objects and maybe increase the density to fill in the areas near the polygons for our original leaves. But that way we could cut out sections without having to use a density map. But there is a little bit of a quicker way, although it may not be as accurate. We're going to open up the bark material again for all of our ecosystem layers, and we're going to start out with our top layer, and you could rename these if you want. I'm going to go ahead and select each one so we know which layer we're working with. Go to our lower, go to the environment tab, and for our slope range, if we reduce the slope range, let's go ahead and do that for all of them, we will start to remove a lot of the instances showing up on those steep slopes, which tend to be more towards the inside of the tree. Although sometimes you will remove some of your leaves in areas where you would like them, but right now we can see just by doing that it opened up the center of our tree, and we still have a very nice concentration around the outside. Some of the areas, of course, are not as densely covered because they are going to be the same slope as our main trunk. So sometimes it is easier to use that decay near foreign objects. But when you're working with multiple trees, it can be a little time consuming, and it really depends on how close you are going to be rendering that tree and how important it is to the scene. A couple other settings we have are the altitude ranges. One thing I'm going to do is just bring our slope ranges all the way back, repopulate, and now because we have a top and a mid and a lower sets of leaves, we could also make sure that we only use those in those parts of the tree. So with the lower, we would decrease the altitude range on top and just populate those instances on the lower branches. And if we wanted to start to fade into the top ones, we could adjust fuzziness for the top, and that way we have a little bit of a fall off, and it's not just going to cut off those instances entirely. And we'll go to our mid and do the same thing from both sides. So we're cutting in from the bottom altitude and the top, and then this time we would want to increase the fuzziness for both the top and the bottom. And then if we select our top one, decrease the altitude range, so it's just populating on the top, and then fuzziness bottom, we can increase that amount and repopulate. Now we can see that that has cut out a lot of our instances, so really it depends on what your other settings are. You might need to tweak it a bit and maybe not have such a decrease, because the more you increase the fuzziness, the less intense these values for the altitude range are going to become. But now we have more of a variation in the tree. And this method also creates an extremely large amount of depth because we don't have to worry about those big polygons making up our leaves. Let's go ahead and just zoom into a section of the tree, and we can render that out and take a look. Now we can see there are still some adjustments that will need to be made to leaf density and certain areas of the tree, but overall this will give you a very good idea of how you can use this technique to really increase the quality of a tree. Another thing we could also use is, instead of actually changing the slope ranges, or the altitude amount rather, we can just use fuzziness values to decrease the amount of instances in those areas without leaving some of the areas extremely unpopulated. In the mid layer, I'm going to increase the scale of those leaves and fill that in a little bit more. And if you feel that maybe, in this case, our lower leaves are hanging down a little bit too far, you could always redesign that instance or that original plant we used for that layer and vary it a bit. You could also add multiple plants to the same layer. So we can go ahead and, for the lower, I can add in our lower 2, which gives us another variation within the same layer. So 2 plants that are very similar, but there are enough variations to make it more realistic. Go ahead and bring down the scale, repopulate, and now we have 2 different types of that lower amount. In the scaling and orientation, we could adjust the direction from our surface and also the rotation of those different objects. And you really have a lot of control over your trees, more than you would just have using a plant within the plant editor. You could always overpopulate if needed. And you can also use the orientation constraints, and that way you could have leaves only showing up on one side of the tree. And you could also use the variable density to set up a function to control where the leaves are going to be showing up on your tree. One neat thing you could do with that is to create an image map with kind of the center cut out, and that way you could restrict population within the center using a map rather than decaying near foreign objects. And so you can maintain your density on the outside of your tree. But we can create some very realistic looking trees this way. And you don't have to be restricted to just leaves either. There are a lot of other plants available, like flowers. We could add another layer to add flowers to this. Let's go ahead and just do that now. Add a layer, exit out, ecosystem, and we can delete that layer, change this to flowers. And you could also just add another object to one of the existing layers if you wanted to have them appear in a certain area of your tree. Or you could create a whole new layer, like I'm doing right now. Go to plants and actually select flowers, and we have the primrose. We can actually use that to add that ecosystem and those plants and flowers onto this object. Now I'm not really seeing them, so what I'm going to do is turn off the visibility for our other layers. And we can see that mainly it's a scale issue. So we'll go back to that flower object, and I'm going to go ahead and increase the scale. Make them a bit larger. You could also change the above and below surface options, and that way it will populate a little bit above your branches. And if you use the proportional to the size of instance, the smaller the object, the less it will protrude from the surface, the larger, the more it will go above or below the surface. Make sure in the environment tab it is going to populate correctly. And then we could oversample the density, bring it up to 500%, and really fill that in. We can see that showing up. I'm going to go back and just turn on those other layers. And because of the concentration of our leaves right now, we may not be able to see the flowers very well unless we change their scale and maybe even create our own species specifically for this tree. But in the preview render, you can start to see little specks of flowers showing up, and also in the preview, we can see the billboards showing up in some of the different areas. So that's another way we could use this technique to really modify a tree. Because normally, if you were to add flowers to a solid growth plant that you want to use for ecosystems, you would have to add that flower to the image map, creating the leaves, and you might not have a lot of depth that way. This way, the entire tree is 3D, and it gives us a lot of flexibility. Another really cool technique, I'm going to go ahead and just remove the primrose and add in a plant I created where I modified the bamboo species to have it hang down by adjusting the angle and the droop. And that allows us to create willow trees. And have a lot of things hanging down from our tree. In this case, we have a lot of angles. So what we can do is go to scaling and orientation, make sure they are only vertical. And then the rotation that we have on the bottom, up axis only, and then 120 degrees for the rotation basically on the Z and the X, and the Y will maintain the same. So now we have these large drooping sections on the tree. I also have another variation of that, where I created vines using the same method. So you could create some rainforest type trees and have a lot of vines hanging down Remember, you will have to modify the color setting. Let's go ahead and take a look at that in the OpenGL, and we can see those vines showing up, and that's based on just the bamboo species. And it gives us a lot more flexibility with our tree and our surfaces, and adds a lot more realism. And you can basically add pretty much an unlimited amount of ecosystem layers to create different types of trees. You could also add flowers to replace the leaves that are on the bamboo species, to have those hanging down in the same way we made our lower leaves for the maple, and really create some very interesting looking trees. I'm going to go ahead and remove that layer. So we just have our maple tree. And now, if we want to animate this, it's going to work a little differently than we would normally animate a tree. It is still based on, within the atmosphere editor, our wind options, but the main difference is we cannot animate the main tree and our trunk, because ecosystems will not move along with those wind settings, because technically the ecosystem method is not really made for creating trees like this, although we can see that we've created some very realistic looking trees using the method. But since our ecosystem instances, we modified the breeze setting and the trunk setting, we will be able to have leaf fluttering and some nice changes within all of the leaves. It's just the main tree itself we cannot have animated. So if we open up our settings for our oak, and we take a look at the wind options, we would need to make sure that our trunk is set to 0 for its wind sensitivity, so it will not react to wind. And that way we can just add a bit of leaf fluttering. And usually this technique's used for creating very large trees, so really those wouldn't move as much as the leaves would anyway, and you would have to have a very large storm for that. If you did want to have larger sections of branches moving, then you can end up using another tree as all of the leaves, and just connect a tree to another tree instead of having to go in and create the different leaf clusters as we did. So with these wind settings now only affecting our ecosystem and not this main tree, we'll end up with a really nice animation. Another thing you can do is turn off the on a per plant basis and just have that little bit of leaf fluttering. Maybe you want to decrease the intensity, although we did basically bring those values down to 0.1 and 0.15 if you remember while we were editing the plant. And if you need a really quick render of an animation to take a look at the leaves, you can use the OpenGL render setting. So if we go ahead and select that from our render options, we're going to use 4 for the quality boost and render that out. It's going to show basically what we would see in OpenGL if we were showing all of our plants full quality near camera. Now depending on the amount of instances you have, it can take a little longer to render. We can see right now that showing up. It does render a lot quicker than, of course, the full quality, and because these are ecosystems, we are getting a really nice image of our different leaves and plants with really not too much of a reduction of quality. So it's a very good preview method, and if we were to create wind animation now, we'd be able to really monitor the leaf fluttering without having to create a very extensive high-resolution render throughout the animation. So the OpenGL method is really great for this method and this type of a tree when you want a quick render just to look at sizes and you're really not paying attention too much to the material. And we can see that showing up in our different leaves. Of course we can't see the specular values or the bump maps, and none of that is rendering, but it still gives us a good idea of the leaf placement and actually a bit of the color in the material. So it's a pretty good method for a quick render. And because both the ecosystem is solid growth and the tree itself, if we wanted a different variation of this tree, we could easily create that. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this one. Control-C on the keyboard and Control-V to make an exact copy. And if you also take a look at the polygon amount, with our overall scene we have 84 million polygons, although most of them are instances, so it really doesn't decrease our system speed at all. And if we were to try to do this method using regular objects, it would actually take a lot longer to render, even if it was a lower polygon count. By using existing view plants and solid growth vegetation files to populate our leaves, we're able to really speed up the render. And that can be quite important, because using a model that we designed ourselves with these different leaves, we would have a huge decrease in system performance and an increase in render times. So let's go ahead and open up this tree, and I'm just going to grow a new one. Now, of course, because the way our materials are, we really can't see it in the preview. So I'm just going to grow a new plant and just assume that it's something a little bit different, and it looks like it is. Now we can see that our ecosystem is being populated in the wrong place. So we will need to open the material and just repopulate each one of those layers. But now we have a solid growth tree where we have two trees with the same material, but now they are shaped differently. And you can use this to create closer areas of a scene, something that's going to be closer to the camera, or if you're just going to be focusing on a couple of main plants. This way you can get some very high resolution, very realistic looking plants, and then you use the other plants for creating your ecosystems. You could also save out your material, which is an ecosystem-based material, and populate this on other trees or on other objects and use it over and over again. So once you have that initial ecosystem created in that bark surface, you can go ahead and copy that over to any plant if you want different branch setups, smaller amounts of branches, and a lot of different variations between different species. You could just go ahead and copy that material from one, which we could do right now. You right mouse click on the material, select which surface it is, and in this case with this tree we actually have multiple surfaces on our trunk, and our subset material can be changed for each branch object, because technically there are 4 sets of branches and 4 trunks for this type of tree, and it really varies depending on the species you're working on, but we could just copy the material, and then in this case we have 4 different versions, because when we copy and paste it over, it ended up creating multiple versions and copies of that material and surface. But you would just have to right mouse click and paste into the correct part. And there's a couple other things we could do with this method. I'm just going to delete these trees from our scene, and I'm going to create another version, another type of a slightly lower quality object. I'm going to load in the maple tree. We're going to go ahead and grow a couple of different versions. And now we're basically going to do the same method we did before. We're going to take our length and width, remove them. I'm going to droop down this tree just a little. Go to our maple leaf Material, and under Transparency, turn off Variable Transparency. Go back to the Bark option. In the Bark material, select Ecosystem, and now we can add in a plant, and I'm going to add in the maple tree. So now we're using the tree itself to add in branches. I'm going to increase our density. Make sure I turn off Decay Near Foreign Objects. Turn on Force Regular Alignment. And now we see that we have some very large maple trees showing up, so we will need to decrease the scale. And when you're using a tree to populate your ecosystem, you're going to find that you're really going to need to oversample much more than with smaller plants, because they take up less surface area and really don't need a lot of a 3D model in order to populate. So we can increase this to 5,000 and hit populate, and now we have all of these trees being populated, sort of creating new branches. Go to Scaling and Orientation, select all axes to have a bit of rotation. We could also increase the maximum rotation, set it to perpendicular, or a little bit in between. And now we have another tree that we can use. In the same way we both animate and create the other one, but in this case we can use the wind options from each of these individual trees to move around large sections of branches and give a little more animation. If you need to, you could also decrease the size of those trees. And now we're just taking a look at the OpenGL render, and we can see all of these branches showing up. And it's a really cool way to create a little more highly detailed trees for something that would basically be distant. Go ahead and render a final quality render of this. And we can see from farther away, it looks really good. Of course, the closer we get, we're going to start to see the same problems we would with the main tree, which is the polygonal leaf shapes. But from farther away, this can create a really nice looking tree. So what you could have is the original tree for ecosystems in the background, and you get closer to the camera and you can start to create trees like this, and then use the tree we were just working on with all the different layers and the really advanced plants for cascading leaves for closer up to the camera. You just need to make sure that your color settings are around the same in order to get it to look correct. Another thing we could do, go ahead and delete that, is if we take our large dead tree and do the exact same thing, open up our bark, add an ecosystem, and add in the large dead tree. We'll just set some of these options, change our scale, and we need to adjust the direction. Increase our density. Let's go ahead up to 250, turn off Decay Near Foreign Objects. And now what we can do is use that tree to add more branches and make an even more complex dead tree. So now we can see all of these extra branches showing up. In this case, what we would really want to do is modify and make another version of the large dead tree so that it didn't have such a large trunk, and that way it would connect correctly to our branches. But we can see that's much more realistic than just the original tree, where it doesn't really have a whole lot of extra branches in there. So you can create some really neat variations, and you can still go in, change the object, grow a new one, and then just open up the material and repopulate. And if we wanted some lower branches, we could change our maximum rotation to 360 to have branches going down below the surface and really moving around. But once again, we are seeing those large trunks where the connections are. So you might want to modify the original tree. You could grab the tree and just change the diameter of the trunk, and then save out that variation. And it's just a really, really cool method for creating very high resolution trees within View. If you have renders of closer trees and not just working on gigantic ecosystems. Because a lot of these trees are designed for very large ecosystems. The only problem is once you start to get closer up and you want to make some renders that are maybe in a small forest where you're very close to other plants, the ground plants will usually look okay, but sometimes with the trees it may not work out correctly, and using this method you don't need to worry about the incompatibility of being able to save the plant out and populate an ecosystem with it. And the reason you can't do that is because you cannot create an ecosystem with another ecosystem. So there's a lot of different techniques you can use along with this, especially with the oversampling. And that method can be used not just on trees but also regular ecosystems. But we can go ahead and add, just to this tree, we'll go ahead and add in the patch of grass. And we'll need to scale that down quite a bit for this object. And this might not work too much. Let's go ahead and change this to reeds. Because the patch of grass is really dispersed. Increase our density, go ahead and oversample that to 5,000, and now we can see almost full coverage except the underneath part of our tree. And usually with ecosystems you can't populate the underneath of an object. It is really based on sort of projecting downward onto the surface. But sometimes you can get away with the rotation values that we have, and also making, like I did before, the other variations to cover the lower parts, so that even though it's populating the instance on the top of the surface, the leaves themselves or the plant are going downward. So there's a lot you can do with that. So now we have a mostly covered tree with that plant, although some of the bark is not fully covered. And if we went to our scale and brought it down a little more, we can see something a little bit finer. And this is a neat way to make moss on trees. Of course, with the vertical alignment of this tree and the way it's positioned, we don't see that kind of fill-in that we would need for the entire bark surface. But one really nice thing is actually we can paint in onto any area of the object. Even though painting also projects downward, if you flip an object upside down and paint on it, you can do the exact same thing. You would just need to make sure that that object is finalized and you don't need to modify its shape at all. So I hope you learned a few things about creating some realistic trees in View using some methods that have been previously untouched and a technique that isn't shown very often. And you'll be able to take a look at renders on the site of different trees I've created, and also some along with the training to really show some better quality renders of the type of things we were just working on, and really see the quality you can end up with by using this technique.